In this video, I'm going over Steam Proton and everything you ever wanted to know, from adding DirectX to using a custom Steam Proton version. So stay tuned. For this video, the layout's going to actually start with inner Steam settings, such as setting the beta option or changing it to actually install or be able to use all games in Steam Proton, and then delving into like Steam Proton variables and how to use async and other things. Then it moves on to Protontricks, winetricks, and winecfg, such as changing from like Windows 7 to Windows 10 if the game calls for it, or installing DirectX 9 or Visual Studio. All that will be explained in that part. And then finally, finishing out the third section of the video will be custom Steam Proton versions. These are mainly meant for specific games that just don't quite work in Wine or Proton officially yet. So with that said, let's jump into it, and I'm going to go ahead and jump on my desktop and show you the first part. So the first thing I want to do here is actually set up Steam to accommodate several things and explain some settings that Proton has and that is not enabled out of the box. So the very first thing I want to show you is under settings is beta participation. I always change this to actually enabled because right now the Steam beta has an option to where you can select your Proton version depending on the game you're in. So if you hit change, make sure that this is actually on Steam beta update. That is the needed version. So let me show you that real fast of why you'd opt in for Steam beta right now as of January 2018. So if we go over to the library and I pick Path of Exile, now you see up at the top here, it says Proton.16-6 Galleon 9's Extras. This is a custom Proton version I have specifically for Path of Exile. And if we go down to Sid Meier's, or actually Shadow of War, you'll see that it is using the default Proton 3.16.6 beta selected for you by all titles. So if we go into Steam again, in settings, and we come down to Steam Play. So we have the beta enabled. We want to enable Steam Play for supported titles, obviously. And then we also want to enable Steam Play for all titles. Now, I always pick the most recent one right here. Obviously not my custom one, because that custom one, I'm not sure how well it'll work with other titles. So I like to stick with the official or the latest official Proton version that's out. So I always select beta and then go. So that's the main things for the actual settings of Steam. Now let's get into the actual variables you'll be using when you are setting up Proton, or you get something like you need to disable async, for instance. So I'm going to scroll up and see if I have Fallout 4 would probably be a good example. So you'll see that it says Proton _ no _ async equals 1 space, and then I went ahead and made an option to show the HUD, or heads up display, FPS. So it'll always show the frames per second when I'm playing Fallout. And then at the end of this command, there's a space and then %, command, %. And this is needed whenever you use any kind of Proton option in Steam. So make sure you're doing this on launch options every time you utilize any of these variables, because if you don't, it won't launch properly. And if you're wondering what variables we are, I'm in the bottom section here. Check the description and I'll list out the variables. I wanted to kind of go over them real fast. Right there is async, which basically think of it as like a virtual sync, or disabling like screen tearing and helping out with that. Well, a lot of times that introduces stutter in some games. So it's one of the most common things you'll see as far as set launch options goes is Proton _ no async, mainly because it disables that function. So you may get a little tear, but it gives you smooth gameplay. So, also something that's really good. to just know. So if you see stuttering, like especially between cutscenes and other things like that, that's when the no async comes really heavily into play. And you might actually test it out and enable that. A couple other options I definitely want to mention here. I'm going to actually scroll back down to Path of Exile because there's a lot of options in it. And this one, for one, real fast, just to say, hey, this is part of the Steam beta. You click this to force use a specific compatibility tool, and then in the drop down, you would select your newest version or your custom version in this instance. But as far as set launch options, I wanted to show a couple ones here. Now, this is for every version of Steam. There's no 3D D11. Basically what this says is disable the DirectX 11 and force the game to utilize DirectX 9. Now, normally you don't want to ever use this option unless you absolutely have to. For Path of Exile, because DirectX 9 or DirectX 11's not the best implementation of it, a lot of titles actually end up struggling, or a lot of computers end up struggling. So you want to actually disable this for Path of Exile in its current incarnation. This next one, Proton use Galleon 9, and then also Node GLSL. These are custom variables exclusive to this custom kernel that I'm running. These are not part of actual Steam variables, but I run these, one, to enable a custom kernel, and two, this actually switches out how the shaders react when you're actually in-game playing. So we know how to basically force DirectX 9 and then do async. Now, one thing I don't actually have in the launch options that I want to show is use WineD3D. And you'll see that in the text below. And basically all this does, it says instead of using Vulkan, you'll use OpenGL. I almost never use this option because I use an AMD card, and if I can utilize Vulkan, I will. So only a very, very select number of games will actually use that option. The other option is Proton force large address where. This is also very rarely used. A lot of Bethesda games can benefit from its usage, but don't necessarily need it. So those are the two kind of obscure options that come by default variables. So let's launch into Protontricks. I'm going to do it before I do winetricks or basic wine configuration, just because I'm only going to breeze through that, because you really should be using Protontricks for Steam Proton. So first off, Protontricks is a wrapper for winetricks. What this means is all the functionality, everything that's done is actually done using winetricks. This just makes shortcuts basically to it. So it's a very easy way to add like DirectX 9 or change the audio options or launch directly into wineconfig. And I'll show you why that is a little bit later, but that's the basis of Protontricks. To get started or installing Protontricks, come to the Matto King GitHub and go into Protontricks. I'll leave the link down below. Come down to the installation section, and you're probably going to want this first installation method. You basically just paste this in and run that. I believe you do need to launch it as super user or sudo. So sudo python 3-m, this whole line right here, and it'll install Protontricks for your system. Now this does go ahead and puts it in the bin folder, so you'll be able to launch Protontricks from anywhere in terminal. The basic usage of Protontricks is this right here. You can do custom commands, which I'm not going to go into in this video just because that it can get a little involved. However, I will go into searching and then running basic things in winetricks and then launching the GUI. So let's go ahead and launch into our terminal and do these things using Protontricks. So first, let's find a game that we want to do Protontricks on. So Protontricks, and we're going to search Fallout. And you'll see I have 3 Fallout games installed. The number beside the game is what we need to pay attention to. This is the actual app ID. So going forward, let's say I want to change some things in Fallout New Vegas. I could simply do Protontricks and then the app ID, which is 22380, and then simply type in either DX9 if I wanted to install DX9, or if you don't know any of it, you could always launch directly into the GUI using the GUI command. So let's go ahead and launch into the GUI because we don't really need to install anything here. But important thing to know, like if you wanted to install Windows fonts, you could do it from Protontricks here. So this will take a little bit. You can safely ignore that warning that was just saying, hey, this is 64-bit. Just leave select as the default, yes. And then if you want to do a DLL, you do here, fonts here, and let's go ahead and do that. So you can select, I'm going to just show you two options, very common ones that are used on games I'm troubleshooting. The first one is DirectX 9. Let's say I don't know what DirectX this needs. I just know it's a version of DirectX 9. I just click this and it will literally install every DirectX 9 package into this game container. And then the second thing that most games need is .NET 4.0 is a big one. If you're having .NET issues, .NET 4.0 typically solves most of them. I will warn you against using many of these other ones unless you find a specific guide that calls for these numbers. Usually just 4.0 is good enough. And down here is Visual C++. A lot of games have this dependency, so VC Run 2010 is probably the most common one out of this slew of them. I will caution, don't just highlight everything in here and hit install. It won't work. You'll break your game install and it'll be a big sad face. So those are the three most common ones you can safely install and pretty much try out if it calls for it. I'm going to go ahead and cancel out because I don't need any of those. Now, the other thing is running like wineconfig or changing the actual setting from like Windows 7 to Windows 10. Run wineconfig is what I need. You can also do registry edits and things of that nature if need be. So you'll see this pulls this up and you can actually change the Windows version. You can add and change how libraries interact with it, which is pretty cool. So let's say I wanted to install like an audio command. Like let's say this is dependent on X audio. I can install this into the library and then mark it native and it'll change kind of the sound. Now I don't recommend doing anything like this directly unless instructions call for it. And there's a cool package called F-Audio, which I do recommend actually installing because it's very good, especially for Bethesda games such as Fallout 4 is one I actually did that fix for. So we'll go ahead and cancel this and we'll go back into here. So you can do registry edits. You can launch directly into the actual Windows Explorer if you wanted. I don't really use many of these options. Reg edits on a rare occasion. I think Final Fantasy 11, I ended up using a reg edit to do some configuration. But past that, this is just kind of getting around and changing the inner workings of a specific Proton game. And I'm not going to go any further than that in this portion of the video. Just know that is Protontricks, how to get around and do all the things you need to do for Protontricks. Now let's say you didn't want to launch into the GUI and you wanted to launch directly into the configuration. You can actually do that by just going Protontricks. So we'll just go and type wineconfig. So some of these commands will actually work also just like that. So in this section it would launch directly into the wineconfig portion to where we can select our Windows version. So much like you can get through it through the GUI, this way is just a little faster if you're in a hurry. I'll go ahead and show that to you. But that's it. And if you do lose some of the syntax or you don't want to pull up this video, remember there is always the help command. So winetricks --help, and this kind of gives you a nice little snapshot of all the little syntax to search and actually run commands. So pretty awesome. The big one is just remembering the GUI, because from there you can pretty much select whatever package you want. So one thing I'm going to mention, I'm not going to go too far in depth here. We've covered Protontricks, and honestly, you should probably use the Protontricks wrapper. Please note that I left the GitHub link to actually install Protontricks. However, if you want to use the default winetricks or launch into wineconfig like we did in Protontricks, I'm going to show you how to do that. You're going to learn real fast why Protontricks exists, because what we have to do is say, hey, what is the actual architecture that we're running on? So for Fallout New Vegas, which we've just used, we go WINEARCH for architecture equals Win64, because it's a 64-bit architecture. And then we need the actual prefix. So we type WINEPREFIX equals, and then you have to put the entire path. So this is a little tedious. I'm going to try to remember here exactly where I put this. I believe Steam library, Steam apps, and compatdata. And then we need the actual game ID. Now, we just did it using the search command on Protontricks. Wine doesn't really have anything like that. So you just got to know what the ID is. Either Google it or drop down into the folders and drill down and figure out exactly what it is. Or you can go into Steam and say, hey, browse local folder, and kind of see where it is actually at. But for this, we know it's 22380. And then from here, we go into PFX. And that is it. So we've established exactly the directory for the prefix. We've established the architecture, and now we can run commands. So from here, you could launch into the GUI just by simply typing winecfg or winetricks. So if we wanted to just do a winetricks where we install DLLs and stuff, you type winetricks. But let's say you needed to change the version of the Windows, you just type winecfg, and then it would go ahead and launch this. So once this pulls up, I'll be able to show that to you. And there's our familiar screen that we just came from. So that's how to manually do it if you don't want to use Protontricks. Or let's say Protontricks, something changes or the project completely dies off. This is the way to do it without using Protontricks. Now, like I said, I'm not going to go any further than this because I just explained how both of these work in Protontricks, and it is just a far better method than having to type all that in, because it's just so confusing trying to find the folders, find the app IDs and all that, where in Protontricks you just go. So let's talk about custom Proton versions. Earlier in the video, I showed you how to select them, but how do you actually install or download them? That is one method I haven't really seen explained in a good way. Now, if you're heavy into Path of Exile, you'll know that the stock versions of Wine or the stock versions of Proton don't work for anything for the game. It crashes, it's buggy, it's laggy, it's just no good. However, this custom version, which I'm using Galleon 9, however, on the forums, most people recommend Kakra's version. Now, this is kind of a hacky version. The Kakra version has like a bin file, and basically what you need to do, I like creating an entire new version of Proton, which you can select from that neat drop down. It makes things so simple. Just know that some versions, if they don't follow this root file structure, if you open up that zip file and it doesn't have all this stuff in the root and then like a bin folder, just know it's not going to really work. You need to actually override another Proton's bin. It probably wants you to override the main official version of Proton's bin file and then just use it. I don't ever recommend doing that, and that's why I really like the Galleon 9 approach, where it actually adds another version. I can just select that version when I'm playing my Path of Exile and have all my other games work just fine without having to use this version. So I wanted to show that structure real fast just so you understand this is how Steam will recognize it. The second thing is how to download it. Now, some people will make the mistake of actually going click download. Don't do that. Go to releases, and then from the releases page you can actually download it right here. Notice 202 megabytes. If it's like 10 megs or 20 megs, you just got the source files and those won't do anything for you, so you need to click download here. Now, I've already downloaded this file so we don't have to wait during this tutorial, and I'm going to flip over to it. So we're going to come over here and we're going to select Galleon 9. And I wanted to show you what this looks like from the tar perspective. and see what the archive is physically structured. Because remember, we need those files in there, otherwise we have to overwrite another version of Proton. So as you see, we have all these different files that match what the structure needed that I just showed. Now, some other custom versions only have this dist folder, and you open it up and it has these 4 folders. They want you to basically take that and override Steam's official Proton. I can't say that enough because it was super confusing when I first started diving into the subject, and there's not much material online about it. So let's say you have this, you want to now extract it. Well, that's great. Where do I extract it to, Titus? I know that's what you're wanting to know. So let me show you. In your home.steam folder, you'll see the shortcut for Steam. Click it here, and this will redirect you to where you need to go. In here, you may see a compatibilitytools.d folder, but you probably won't if this is the first time you've ever done anything like this. You need to right-click, create a new folder, and call it compatibilitytools.d. In here, now this is where you drop your custom folder. So I would extract all this information. We're going to go back one. And I would just extract this into here like I did. Close this, and everything is already set. That's it. So we would just restart Steam, and then we would see that custom file. Now, I'm going to show that one more time just so you don't have to flip back in the video. You see that it's running that custom Galleon 9 extras right here. Just go right-click Properties, and from the Properties page, you just check Force Use of Specific Steam Compatibility Tool and select the new version we've added in Compatibility Tools. This makes it so you can do custom Proton versions for certain games like Path of Exile in this instance. It is very important to know. I can't emphasize enough because this took me probably hours trying to piece together all the information around the net to get exactly what it is, because there's so many custom versions of Proton. Some use the hacky method where you're overriding an existing method. That's why if you check on the description down below, I like this version of Proton because it is very compatible with a lot of different versions. It has most of those features built in and makes this super simple. So just know that, and that is custom Proton versions in a nutshell. So that was the entire gamut of Steam Proton. You should now know how to do pretty much anything you want to do or anything you read online in Steam Proton. It's a fantastic platform, and I really like setting all my games up in it. This is mainly due to once you get this set up, it's pretty much just go down your list and hit play, and it just launches. There's no more configuration. There's no more, oh, where's that shortcut? It just works, which is just amazing, and it's just a great thing. But again, I had to make this video just because a lot of the content in it, I had to do a lot of research and slowly find, after weeks of kind of searching out the interwebs to find all these different things. So especially the custom Steam Proton versions, very difficult to find how to use certain versions of these because they're kind of a hacky thing. So these are kind of like I cherry picked and picked the best of all of them. So out of all the things I've done, I picked the best ways to implement them so you can easily get in and configure Steam Proton to your liking. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and leave for today, and I'll see you in the next video.